Geek Soup. And I'm John Vinalas. We are going to have a really, really fun episode today. I'm just sure of it. Because not only is my good friend Aaron Welty with us.
Hey, everybody. How you doing tonight?
We also have a very, very special guest, and I'm excited for him to be on this episode with us. We're talking about Ant-Man tonight. And in keeping with the theme of all things small, we have with us tonight my little boy, my 8-year-old son, Caleb Vinalas. Hi, Caleb.
Hello.
All right. So
I don't really speak like that.
Well, you just speak the way you speak, and it's going to be great.
Okay.
So we're going to have a blast, and we're going to talk about Ant-Man. And let's kick it right off. So Caleb, which of the Marvel movies have you seen? You've seen Ant-Man.
Yeah, I've seen Ant-Man. I've seen Marvel where they fight Loki and the Chitauri. Is that right?
The Chitauri, yeah. So the Avengers.
And I've seen Captain America and Thor.
Right. Okay. So you know most of the things that are going on there just in terms of the Avengers.
Yep. And
so we're going to be able to talk about that a little bit as it relates to Ant-Man. So the production of this film is kind of an interesting story because it was a fairly troubled production. It took a long time to get off the ground. Edgar Wright was attached to it for a while. And he's well known for really like quirky and interesting films. He directed. Did he also write the adaptation for Scott Pilgrim? Aaron, do you know?
Well, I absolutely know that he directed it.
Right.
I wouldn't be surprised if he had at least some involvement in the writing. But if so, I don't think it was him alone.
Yeah. What else is he really known for? Because honestly, those are the only two that I am actually familiar with.
Right. So other things that he happens to be known for are Shaun of the Dead.
Oh, right, the Cornetto trilogy. Right. Okay.
Shaun of the Dead, which is a spoof on zombie movies. Hot Fuzz, which is a spoof on action movies, and I think.
Whatever the end of the world one is. The bar at the world's end?
I think that's the one where they go bar hopping. I actually haven't seen that one.
Yeah.
But the other two I've seen at least once.
Okay. Right. So he was kind of butting heads with Marvel creatively. I think he ended up with some kind of did he end up with a writer's credit still on the final?
I think he may have. I'm actually looking it up right now.
Yeah, I think he ended up with a writer's credit on the final version of the film. But I'm sure would be interested to know what kind of things were the deal breakers in that whole scenario.
Right. As it happens, he actually did end up with a screenplay credit on Scott Pilgrim.
Okay. Right. So yeah, that's in terms of the production of this film, but as far as the comic character, Ant-Man is a character that goes way back, and in terms of his history with the Avengers, he actually goes back further even than Captain America, than Hawkeye, Scarlet Witch, Black Widow. Most of the folks that we see in the films. Or at least a good portion of them were not founding Avengers. Because in the comics, the original lineup, and if I miss one, Aaron, help me out, there was Iron Man and Thor and Hulk and Ant-Man and the Wasp. I think it was just those 5, right?
I think so. Because didn't after the first issue, didn't they start changing the lineup right away?
Well, Hulk left really early on because he understood that he was just too much of a crazy liability for the rest of the team. So he left very early on. The Avengers have always had a lineup that's just really been in flux, like all of the time. But Captain America didn't show up. I think it was issue 7
Okay.
when they ended up pulling Cap out of the ice, and it's interesting. Like, it's interesting how much he has like continued to be the sort of man out of time shtick, because in the original timeline, he was only in the ice for like 20 years.
Right.
But obviously the further on, and because of Marvel's like sliding scale timeline, that chunk of time keeps getting longer and longer.
Reasons as to why Spider-Man is still like in his early 30s at most.
Right. Yep. So anyway, but the character of Hank Pym showed up in the comics before he even was in costume as Ant-Man. It was just like a one-off. Back in those days, and actually the first appearance of Spider-Man was one of these kinds of things too. In those days, you had like these anthology comics where you would have an issue of Amazing Fantasy or Journey into Mystery or any of these kinds of comic books that had just little one-off stories in them. Sort of as a proof of concept, or and some of them weren't even intended to launch into their own books or into a starring role necessarily. There's a ton of those little stories that just were strictly a one-off thing and then were never heard from again. But Henry Pym shows up for the very first time in January of 1962, just as Hank Pym, a guy who can shrink and communicate with ants. And then, that was a successful story. And so 8 months later, he appears as a superhero in costume with his girlfriend / lab assistant / socialite, Janet Van Dyne.
Right.
And she becomes the Wasp pretty quickly after that. And then about a year after that, they are inducted into the Avengers in 1962, or 1963 rather.
Because I'm looking it up because I think there's actually kind of a passing reference to it into the film. Wasn't the first appearance in an issue of Tales to Astonish?
I think you're right. Yeah, that was the name of that book. Yeah,
I'm pretty sure.
Yeah,
I'm pretty sure that's what it
because
was.
that's what Darren Cross kind of says.
Exclaims to everybody.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And in the comics, after his appearance as a founding Avenger, Henry Pym has been a really what's the word I'm looking for? A prominent figure in Marvel Comics, and has done a ton of stuff throughout the decades. He's gone through a half a dozen different costumed identities. He's been called Goliath and Giant Man and Yellow Jacket.
Yep.
And also, not real long ago, he actually took on the code name of Wasp after Janet died during Secret Invasion, or was thought to have died. That's a complicated story that we're not going to really get into right now.
Fair.
But yeah, Henry Pym was the original Ant-Man. And then a while later, you have Scott Lang shows up in the comics. And he was originally kind of, if memory serves, he originally was sort of just a thief, and not so much of a technical wizard as you see him portrayed in the comic or in the movie. And his storyline as he first appeared was that it did involve Darren Cross, who had a problem with his heart, and he was trying to steal the heart of Scott Lang's daughter, and so that's what first brought him into conflict with Cassie Lang, who ends up also becoming a hero in her own right much later on.
Right.
And is part of the Young Avengers. But let's go ahead and talk.
That's a lot, man.
Yeah,
there's a lot.
There's a lot going on. As soon as you start talking about Hank Pym, like the the references go. It gets really, really deep. There's a lot
Right,
going on
and
there.
complicated, and I mean even the fact that as it relates to some of the other Marvel movies, particularly Avengers 2, I mean they change the origin in terms of how Ultron comes to be, but you and I both know that from the comics that was actually something that Hank Pym did.
Right. Yep. Yeah, it's an interesting interesting deviation for the source material. So let's go ahead and get into the movie a little bit.
Okay.
And right off the bat, one of the things that I thought was cool, I liked how they tie it together. For me, it was really, really interesting that they brought Hank Pym in Pym in as a much older character.
Right.
That was really an interesting move to make. And when he shows up there at the beginning, and it was so cool to me to see Howard Stark there again, to see a slightly older Peggy Carter there was a lot of fun.
Right.
One thing that impressed me was that they did a really, really decent job with the de-aging CGI on Hank Pym.
They really did. I remember the first time I saw it when it came out opening weekend. One of the things I thought was, another film around that time in the mid to late '80s that Michael Douglas is pretty well known for is Wall Street, and
Right.
his Gordon Gekko character on Wall Street. And I looked at it and I was like, I know he's not that young now, but it reminded me somewhat of his Gordon Gekko character.
Interesting. So honestly, I haven't actually seen that movie, so I couldn't comment on that. But it's cool that the visual callback was enough to remind you of an actual role of his from approximately that same time frame.
Yep. That's how you know they did a good job.
Yeah.
But I mean,
Well,
even getting to see Peggy Carter there and Howard Stark, and like as they were kind of coming in on the initial shot from the outside, you can see that they're in the midst of building the Triskelion right there on the river.
Right. Yeah, that is really cool. It's neat to see that continuity be a thing that is taken seriously. And I know there are issues with the timeline of the Marvel films. Something that I heard just earlier today in a different podcast that I was listening to that I didn't really realize before was that a lot of those Phase 1 movies actually seem to be taking place in like 1 week of time. Thor.
Really? That close?
Yeah. There was actually a comic tie-in called Fury's Big Week, and Thor and the present day events in the first Avenger and Iron Man 2 and I think even Incredible Hulk all take place within 1 week of time.
Wow.
Yeah. So that was kind of interesting.
That just makes Nick Fury more awesome.
Right?
Right? But I remember a number of years ago I had done a conversation at the theater on Avengers, and the way I tended to describe Nick Fury was essentially the Jack Bauer of the Marvel Universe.
A little
from
bit.
24. And
Yeah,
and hearing that even further affirms it for me.
Yeah. So again, it's just another example, and I kind of hate to keep saying this, but it is relevant every time. It's another great example of how Marvel Studios in the MCU has been really bold in making story level changes to these